This presentation has been prepared by the Hewlett-Packard Pension Association to highlight the injustice being suffered by 100,000 UK pensioners, an injustice that has been largely ignored by all those in a position to help. The issue stems from the 1995 Pensions Act, which made it a legal obligation for defined benefit pension providers to make annual adjustments to pensions in payment to compensate for inflation. However, this protection was granted only to pensioners who worked after April 97. It didn't apply to pension contributions accrued before that date. Most UK employers recognised the need to act fairly and made provision to pay regular increases to all their pensioners, regardless of when their contributions were made. But a small number of employers decided they would only pay increases to their pensioners when they were legally obliged to do so. These employers include Hewlett-Packard, usually known as HP. We represent some 3,500 pensioners who worked for Digital Equipment Corporation during the 1980s and 90s. The business was acquired by Compaq in 1998 and then by HP in 2002, since when the company has effectively frozen pre-1997 pensions. With no discretionary cost of living increases to mitigate the effects of inflation, the purchasing power of these pensions has almost halved and will continue to erode. Other wealthy US-based corporations are also withholding discretionary increases from their UK pensioners. These companies include 3M, Unisys, IBM, Foster Wheeler, Chevron and others, affecting some 100,000 UK pensioners in total. We're asking for action to be taken to correct this injustice. But first, a bit of background. During the 1980s and 1990s, digital played a leading role in the creation and development of the worldwide computer networks on which the planet now depends. It was a time of great excitement and rapid growth in a company which operated on principles of integrity and trust. Do the right thing was the operating principle on which the business was based. This ethical approach, together with the opportunity to contribute to groundbreaking new developments in technology, attracted some of the best talent in the industry. This ethos, which was so much a part of our daily working life, meant that we trusted the company to protect the value of our pensions against inflation. It was a trust fully justified before the HP takeover. The left-hand graph compares the cumulative growth in the RPI, the blue line, with pension increases paid by Digital and then Compaq, the green line, during the 13 years before HP's takeover in 2002. It demonstrates that both Digital and Compaq paid regular increases broadly in line with inflation, and the sum of discretionary increases amounted to 94% of the growth in the RPI. The right-hand graph shows the total discretionary increases paid by HP, the red line, between 2002 and 2016. These amount to just 1% of the cumulative growth in the RPI, the blue line again. As you can see, our pensions have effectively been frozen for the past 15 years. What makes it worse is that until at least 2006, HP continued writing letters to its prospective retirees, making it clear that the company intended to continue to pay discretionary increases along the same lines as Digital and Compaq. We assumed these quotation letters were contractual promises, just like our employment contracts or any other important financial product. It seems we were wrong. Did HP stop paying cost of living increases to pensioners because the business couldn't afford it? We don't think so. Take a quick look at HP's 2015 financials shown here. The cost of increasing 3,500 pre-1997 pensions in line with inflation would have been less than the CEO's paycheck. Also, HP does pay regular increases in all countries where it's legally obliged to do so, which covers most of the schemes it supports. Clearly, the reason the company doesn't pay increases in the UK is because, in the eyes of the law, it doesn't have to. You can see the effect this is having. This simple bar chart shows how much of the main income groups have advanced over the past 14 years compared with the cumulative increase in the RPI. The chart tells us that all groups have broadly kept pace with inflation, all except the digital pensioners, with a meagre 3% uplift, including GMP. Yet, during the same period, pre-1997 pensions have overall increased by 40%, and the salaries of HP's UK employees have increased by 36%. What adds insult to injury is that HP's senior management have, on a number of occasions, assured both the Pensions Minister and the Pensions Ombudsman that, and I quote, "the company seeks to treat its pensioners fairly, balancing its obligations to both former and current employees." They also claim that the company takes market practice into account when deciding whether discretionary increases should be awarded. We asked HP to explain the criteria and evidence used in its annual reviews and discretionary increase decisions, but they won't share this information. Hardly surprising, is it, when their decisions are so far adrift from market practice? So that's the big picture. This is what it means at an individual level when discretionary increases to pensions are withheld. This example is based on a digital employee who retired in 2002 at the age of 60 on a pension of £10,000 a year. Based on the 44% cumulative growth in RPI referred to in the previous bar chart, the buying power of his pension is now worth the equivalent of £5,600 a year. If inflation were to run at an average of 5% over the next 10 years, which doesn't seem at all unlikely, then by the age of 85, the buying power of John's pension will be less than a third of its original value. Before Sir Philip Green was persuaded to inject extra funds into the BHS pension scheme, the BHS pensioners stood to lose between 10 and 15% of their pension. John and others like him stand to lose 72%. For many of our pensioners, the prospect of reduced income on this scale has meant having to continue working into old age, cutting back on many of the comforts they thought they'd earned, and in some cases, having to rely on the state to meet their essential needs. They all believe they've been cheated and feel a deep sense of betrayal. Their confidence that the law is there to protect their interests is simply non-existent. The Prime Minister has on numerous occasions pledged that the government will address the unfair treatment of those who are just about managing, particularly those whose future security depends on hard-earned pensions that are at risk from the actions of unscrupulous company bosses. The former Under-Secretary of State for Pensions, Richard Harrington, acknowledged that HP has a moral obligation to its pensioners and thought his persuasion would influence the company to change its behaviour. It didn't. We're therefore seeking confirmation from the responsible ministers that the PM's pledge is not limited to Sir Philip Green's behaviour and applies more broadly to all pensioners who are demonstrably suffering at the hands of unscrupulous company bosses. That there are serious flaws in current legislation that legitimise such behaviour, and that the forthcoming white paper on security and sustainability in defined benefit pension schemes will introduce appropriate remedial measures. We believe there are three main loopholes in present legislation that need to be addressed in the white paper. Current legislation requires that all pensionable service accrued after April 1997 must be indexed in line with inflation subject to a cap. However, all service accrued before April 1997 has no legal protection from inflation at all. A very few unscrupulous employers have chosen to exploit this inequity. They have permanently withheld discretionary increases to pre-1997 pensions, in effect freezing the income of their older pensioners indefinitely. Apart from pre-1997 pensions, it's difficult to think of any other business costs which don't have to be adjusted from time to time as a result of inflation: materials, operating expenses, rents, prices, salaries, dividends, and so on. Why, when all other boats are allowed to rise with the incoming tide, should the pre-1997 pensioners' boat be the only one that's firmly chained to the bottom? The previous Under-Secretary of State for Pensions sought to justify this discrimination on the grounds that, when this legislation was introduced, mandatory indexation for all pensions would have carried a cost too high for many schemes to bear. We have evidence that shows the Minister's concerns were based on false assumptions. It is, for the vast majority of schemes, eminently affordable today. The second flaw arises because prospective pensioners are led to believe that their employer's pension quotation is a statement of intent regarding the future pattern of increases they should expect. But the law allows the employer to decide that increases don't have to be paid at all because they're classified as discretionary. This can only be viewed by pre-1997 pensioners as casting aside the terms of their pension quotation without explanation or justification. In other words, they see it as a breach of contract. One of our pensioners told me, "Before I opted to sign up for a pension with HP, I considered transferring my fund to an alternative scheme. But HP sent me a formal pension quotation which showed the pattern of discretionary increases paid to my former colleagues. The quotation made clear that it was the company's intention to continue making similar payments in future. So, on the basis of the quotation, I signed up." Heavy fines and punitive compensation would be imposed on any UK financial services provider which deliberately reneged on the terms of its quotations, particularly when it's a hugely important financial product like a pension. So, why do different rules and different ethical standards apply to employers? The third loophole arises because pension quotations containing a declared intention to pay discretionary increases in respect of pre-1997 service are usually qualified with the proviso that increases are subject to affordability. This should mean that in the event of financial pressures which demand the sacrifice of benefits from all stakeholder groups, pre-1997 pensioners should not be excluded. Most pensioners would fully understand that increases might be inappropriate at a time when a business is under financial stress and when discretionary payments to other stakeholder groups are being withheld. The subject to affordability proviso is not inherently unreasonable, but it needs to have a more precise meaning in law than it currently has. The underlying principle should be that, should the significant withholding of normally paid increases prove necessary, this withholding must be borne fairly across all stakeholder groups. The sacrifices of one group should not fund the benefits of another. I said there was evidence that the incremental cost of paying cost of living increases to all scheme members with pre-1997 service would be fully supportable. Well, here it is. This data comes from the government's own Office of National Statistics and shows that almost all pensioners with pre-97 accruals are already being paid regular increases, 95% of them in fact. Being legally compelled to do what's already being done would be a zero-cost activity. The only pension scheme members not receiving regular increases are either in stressed schemes which genuinely can't afford it, 3%, or in schemes such as the digital section of the HP plan, which don't pay increases as a matter of policy rather than affordability, 2%. The recent Green Paper on security and sustainability in defined benefit pension schemes also confirms that affordability issues appeared to be limited to a small number of stressed schemes for which separate proposals are being considered. The claim that universal indexation would damage healthy schemes may have been true in the past, but there is no evidence to support this contention today. There are three prevailing misconceptions to be overcome if we're to make progress. First, the mistaken belief that there's a hidden affordability issue to be overcome in most schemes. As the ONS data very clearly shows, this belief is not supported by the evidence. Yet some will no doubt cling to this erroneous belief as one of their objections to any change. Second, I've demonstrated that it's flaws in the legislation itself which underlie many of the present difficulties. Merely beefing up the powers of the pensions regulator won't be sufficient remedy unless these loopholes are first closed. We need to be sure that this is fully understood. Third, speaking as a pension consumer, I have the overwhelming impression that the government is almost exclusively focused on fund deficits and related supply-side issues. I've seen no evidence of a genuine interest in addressing pensioner protection issues and consumer grievances. The HPPA hopes this is not the case, but we remain deeply sceptical at this stage. David Gok, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, recently said of the forthcoming white paper that he wants to restore the public's confidence in final salary pension schemes. We'd like to invite him to consider what it will take to restore the confidence of the 100,000 pensioners on whose behalf I am speaking. If you were being subjected to the same treatment as the digital pensioner community, would you have confidence in defined benefit pensions and the rule of law? When the terms set out in your employer's pension quotation aren't worth the paper they're written on? When the annual reviews conducted by your former employer aren't based on any reasonable criteria or comparisons, and they won't explain how they reached their decisions? When current legislation appears to legitimise unscrupulous and unethical practices? When the Green Paper aimed at reforming defined benefit pensions is only concerned with supply-side issues? When the value of your pension diminished to less than a third of what you thought you could expect? And finally, when the Pensions Minister expresses great sympathy with your plight and disapproval of your pension provider, but tells you nothing can be done. These points accurately summarise the sentiments of every single member of our community, and doubtless of the 100,000 others who are receiving similar treatment. We need your help to ensure the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, David Gok, and the new Under-Secretary of State for Pensions, Guy Opperman, are made fully aware of our situation and that they understand the pressing need for action. We need clear and positive answers to these 3 points. We need to know that the Prime Minister's pledge and manifesto commitment to protect pensioners from the actions of unscrupulous company bosses includes the 100,000 pensioners on whose behalf I'm speaking. We need the government to accept that revisions to existing legislation, in particular to the indexation rules, are badly needed. We need to know what corrective measures the Minister intends to include in the forthcoming white paper. Gaining satisfactory answers on these 3 points is an important first step towards justice for 100,000 pensioners. Please lend us your support by insisting that they are fully and properly addressed. Thanks for listening, and do please help us in any way you can.